Hello, and welcome back to From the Ground Up, a UC3P public policy podcast in the Harris School at UChicago. I'm Logan. I'm joined by Christian.
Howdy.
Karan.
Hello, everyone.
And Dapo.
Good to be here again.
For our listeners here at Harris, we hope you're all making it through midterms all right and staying warm as it gets colder. So far this quarter, we've held our Resources and Development in Africa Summit. We hope you all thoroughly enjoyed that. We interviewed Dr. Hudson, and we interviewed Rob LeBay, and we thought it would be good to do a bit of a mid-quarter check-in. So, first of all, how is everyone doing? What's everyone been up to? Christian, how about you?
Yeah, so I've been pretty busy this quarter. As you guys know, I had founded TexChange Unbrokered, which has accelerated rapidly since our graduation from the Polsky Accelerated Build program. Additionally, I'm taking full course load, M&A, competition policy, so you can see my mind is just pretty jumbled up.
And that is completely valid. Kram, what about you?
For me, the quarter has been pretty great, I guess. I've been settling in to a new country, to the new university, getting used to a lot of new things here. It's been busy in terms of the coursework, but yeah, and it gets cold in Chicago. So that's something that I'm getting to experience for the first time. Apart from that, I think it's been a very rewarding week and month in terms of exploring various policy topics, starting from energy to international development. And I'm very thankful that our HSOs are actively trying to do a lot of information sharing. So yeah, things have been pretty great here.
That's awesome to hear. What about you, Dapo?
This quarter has been great so far. It's been really hard to manage my schedule given how much work you have to do during the core. But I'm also really excited for all the opportunities here. Honestly, it's been even better than I thought it was going to be. And I'm very excited for the next quarter. I just want to be done with this one, be done with my finals, and, we'll see where we take it from.
Yeah, I absolutely get that. Christian and I completely relate. We went through the core too, and I mean, suffice to say, it's a bit brutal, but you get through. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's the friends you make along the way, as I like to say sometimes. Also, I guess just talking a bit about what I've been doing this quarter, relating to you here too. I'm a TA for a course right now. It's called Politics and Policy. It's an undergraduate course with Professor Christopher Berry. I don't know if any of you have met him, but he's great. And the course is an undergraduate version of analytical politics. So I've also been brushing up on my AP. I've really been getting in the weeds of spatial theories of voting and politics, and it's been really good. And there's also a very different dynamic with undergraduates taking that kind of course. There's a different dynamic. But I've been enjoying that a lot. I've been enjoying my courses. I'm taking cost-benefit analysis, and I've been taking government program oversight. That one is taught by Joe Ferguson, who's the former Inspector General of Chicago. And I'm taking regional innovation, and it's all going well. So I wanted to talk a bit about the news today in this mid-quarter check-in. There's been a lot of news regarding our podcast. We talk about natural resource extraction. We've talked a lot about how important infrastructure is to the process of natural resource extraction, manufacturing, production, implementation, everything in between, right? There is right now in Panama, Christian and I were just talking about it. There's a lot of developments happening regarding, there's a new mining law. There's a drought, and this is affecting shipping rates. Did you want to talk a bit about that, Christian?
Yeah, there's a few things going on down in South America, Central America, particularly in Panama. Over the course of the year, and even longer, there's been a case that between First Quantum's mining project, copper mine project, and their contract with the government. The mine is called Cobre Panama Copper Mine. This week, there was a last-minute move to eliminate part of a bill that would have otherwise upended the approval of the mine. But, however, the new law does ban all future mining and concessions going forward in the future and renewals for any mines that are existing in Panama. And so it is likely that the Supreme Court of Panama is going to decide whether this is constitutional or unconstitutional. And as such, there's been some civil unrest protests going on in country, which has sparked a lot of controversy around this case. Additionally, there's a drought that's affecting shipping rates in the Panama Canal. Shipping containers cannot move through the canal because the water is so low. And so shipping rates have gone up as ships have to go around the continent to get to other markets, whether that's in Western Europe from the United States or from the United States to China and Southeast Asian regions or elsewhere.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think I was reading an article that really contextualizes the problem. So the crisis basically pertains to the fact that Panama Canal is not per se at its optimal utilization and operations. How it affects the trade, it's affecting a lot of vessels either to delay their journey, like Christian mentioned, and taking a alternate route through the Suez Canal, if I'm not mistaken. And it's adding at least 7 to 8 days for critical resources, including liquefied natural gas, coal, and even perishable products like agricultural produce. So in the long scheme of things, if one analyzes the problem, it is far more impactful and far more concerning than one might perceive in the short term, because the repercussions of it are probably here to stay at least for the next 3 to 4 months till the situation gets better. And it would be interesting to see how the Panama's authorities are able to manage the crisis, and how the private entities, the shipping vessels, and the countries that are heavily dependent on the route come to a cooperation of sorts to actually address the crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that, Christian, your work in TexChange, it's a different environment altogether, but you intend to work on reducing inefficiencies in global markets regarding natural resources, right? And so I want to understand better, what do you see the place of your work in things like this, or things that can happen in the future?
Right. So TexChange Unbrokered, to give you guys a little bit of a rundown, is a digital B2B marketplace for private upstream firms in the value chain, particularly mines, manufacturers, mills, agriculture companies, petroleum companies, to buy and sell their raw materials, components, and services throughout the value chain in the global market. We do this by utilizing AI, blockchain, and supply chain mapping technology. You can tell I've said that a bunch of times. So where events like this come in is we're actually developing an AI consultant, if you will, that develops objective due diligence reports on each firm that operates in our marketplace, taking in factors like political unrest, social unrest, environmental concerns, violations, citations, accidents, the current market, and shipping as well, in addition to visualizing the supply chain in an easy-to-use mobile application. So this simplifies the transaction process of purchasing materials and services than it had previously. There are some existing markets, there is some traction, and we're gaining traction, particularly in agriculture and construction. But in the Western countries in the United States, we have utilized primarily commodity brokers to do this, and because of that, it's inefficient. These are logistics software, phone calls, personal relationships done over the phone, and we aim to streamline that process by replacing the need for those brokers.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I wanted to ask you about it because you've been working on TexChange for a while now, and I've seen you've put so much work into it, and I think it gets really understated, at least to us people who haven't been particularly involved in mining, natural resources, policy or otherwise for a while, and we're just starting to learn more about it. I think it gets understated. The vast amount of logistics that goes into quite literally everything, right? We're talking about infrastructure and how you have to make plans for, first of all, how are you going to extract the resources? Then how are you going to pick up the resources? How are you going to transfer the resources? Who's going to receive the resources? Everything, every step of the way requires logistics. And I think it's really interesting how you're incorporating artificial intelligence into that. And sorry to my listeners, this isn't me doing an advertisement. I genuinely think it's really interesting. I wanted to move on now, since this is a mid-quarter check-in and we've had a couple episodes that have been released. Again, Resources and Development in Africa, Dr. Hudson, Rob LeBay, amazing interviews, amazing interviewees. And I hope that for our listeners, if you haven't listened to them, that you go back and do so, because they're truly great people to speak to, great events. I wanted to ask you all, what have been some of the takeaways that you've gotten from these interviews we've had thus far? Anything that struck out to you, anything that was particularly notable or interesting that you wanted to talk about with our listeners too?
Yeah, I really liked our interview with Rob LeBay. He's actually going to be speaking to our Harris students at the Cyber Infrastructure for Critical Industries event that we're hosting here, sponsored by Harris Tech, MASH, and our very own UC3P. So what's interesting about that interview is that Rob LeBay emphasizes that there are weaknesses in the cyber infrastructure for critical industries, particularly in the mining and metal space. So there seems to be a need to emphasize the importance of cybersecurity, particularly in the United States, that has fallen behind with the times as we've moved on, particularly in the mining and metal space. And that's why we actually put this event together, so that we could bring Rob LeBay and some other experts to speak on this, and hopefully we can make meaningful policy legislation, recommend policy legislation right here at Harris in front of our students. So some of the guests that will be attending are 1871's White Toot, which is another cyber consultant firm, Amal Ali from Elysium Strategy, who's an affinity group based in D.C., and Dylan Hopp, Veterans and Military Liaison for Senator Tammy Duckworth of Illinois, in addition to other liaisons for U.S. House Representatives Committee on Cyber Infrastructure and Protections.
Yeah, and to our listeners, for reference, that's an advertisement. We are officially plugging Cyber Infrastructure in Critical Industries, November 9th, 1 to 2 p.m. Please do sign up, register. It'll be Keller 0010, and it will be a great event. And food is provided.
I was just discussing with you guys earlier that I'm very, very interested in exploring the intersection of geopolitics and energy sector space. And I'm also very passionate about the education and skilling space when we look at the energy sector from that lens, because that sector has a potential of probably employing a lot of people, provided certain skill sets are provided to them. So I think I particularly enjoyed the one event and one podcast that we had. What was my major takeaway from Dr. Hudson's podcast is, I think when Christian asked him as to how he thinks African nations would benefit from mineral extraction and how can we make it more equitable, Dr. Hudson approached it from a very policy and education lens and employability lens. That was pretty interesting, because how he approached the problem was the government needs to place a policy which ensures that the companies who are operating in the African countries are employing a major chunk of their workforce from that country itself. And not only at the level that suits the company, but at a level that is across the spectrum, right? From low-skilled workers to the high-skilled workers and everything in between. So that was a very interesting take that I thought. And I believe he also mentioned that a couple of countries are successfully doing that, including Nigeria. The other lens that he took was he was mentioning about a project where the intent is to actually drive some meaningful education efforts on the ground. So taking that lens, he said that companies need to start realizing that ultimately whom they are catering to by fueling in finances for education purposes can possibly convert into a meaningful resource for them in the future and also generate employability in the country. Now, going back to the Africa and Resources event that we had, I mean, we had already discussed this, but this line just stuck with me, which is earlier, one of the panelists remarked that earlier it was geopolitics that was driving a lot of things, including energy and policy. Now it's the other way around. It's the energy sector, rare minerals that are driving geopolitics, and it's such a powerful tool, right? Another lens that I think all of the panelists uniformly agreed on is that Africa does have a lot of potential to actually provide the world, not only itself, but also the world with rare minerals and also energy resources. But what needs to be done is to see Africa not as one unit, but as a collective of 50 plus countries that have nuanced cultural differences, nuanced economic differences, political differences, and while appreciating that, to develop a policy that is specifically contextualized to harness the potential of that country. That was, to me, extremely powerful, because that is something that we often do not hear when somebody is thinking about Africa. People tend to be reminded of a collective entity of the African continent, but not the countries itself. That was pretty interesting, but simultaneously, the panelists also remarked that there are a lot of political instability there, so that would be interesting to see how the countries cope up with that.
That was very comprehensive. Dapo, you had some thoughts, right?
Yeah, just, what Karen was saying is absolutely interesting, and so much has happened in that space, even since the time we published our last episode where we were talking about Africa. For example, yesterday, Bloomberg just released a new documentary about the Biden's administration effort to revitalize a century-old rail line linking key African mines to an Atlantic Ocean port. The name of the documentary is China's Grip on Africa's Minerals Sparks a U.S. Response. I think everyone should check it out if you're interested in this sort of topic. The initiative is called the Libido Corridor. The U.S. has invested hundreds of millions of dollars on the project. At the same time, this week, the United States announced that they would be removing 4 African countries from the African Growth and Opportunity Act Trade Preference Program. They're going to be removing Gabon, Niger, the Central African Republic, Uganda. It's super interesting to me because it exposes the complexities of the United States economic and political interest in Africa. And, obviously the Biden administration realizes that they have to compete with China in Africa, and they're trying to change their strategy. And in the coming months, we're going to see how that's going to shape up before the next election. And also, I think we probably would come back to this topic because something's changing every week. It's a very hot topic. And I think there'll be so much more to talk about in coming months.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's very interesting. Let me see if I can kind of try and synthesize what you, Dapo and Karan, what you both just said, because the Resources and Development in Africa Summit also very much, it stuck out to me. I learned a lot there. And I think we're bringing up a very interesting point. First, to Karan, you said how each African nation has its own intricacies, complexities, nuances. You cannot treat Africa as a single unit. I mean, it's a whole continent. There's just no way you can do that. And that should be obvious, but it's apparently not to certain policymakers, I guess. And along with that, you're saying, Dapo, you're saying how the United States comes in and tries to create these policies for its own benefit, for trade and whatnot. Like, maybe it'll end up helping the African nation to some extent, but it is really just, what is the United States kind of getting out of this? And you said, when asked what is the relationship between the United States and African nations, and people didn't really have an answer to that, there is an objectively correct take here that, and objectively, I guess, from my point of view, it's an imperial relationship. I think that must be said. The United States has an imperial colonial relationship with all of Africa, and that brings us to the idea of self-determination. That I know we're policymakers, we think about what do we need to make a policy for, how will we improve this situation, but I think a lot of times, especially in colonial and imperial contexts, we need to think about, instead of what can we do to make that place better, what can we do to give them the tools of self-determination to make them have full sovereignty and ability to make their own lives better, whether it means developing different relationships with other countries, whether it means changing the dynamics of who is benefiting in these trade agreements, so on and so forth. Thank you, all of you, for your input today. To our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this somewhat different pace for our podcast. We'll definitely be having more interviews coming in the future. And what we talked about today, I feel like we could explore so much more about it. So hopefully you will see that on the horizon. Speaking of on the horizon, November 9th, 1 to 2 p.m., once again, is the Cyber Infrastructure in Critical Industries event. That will be here in the Keller Center, and food will be provided, so definitely show up for that. As a bit of side news, this quarter is going to be my last quarter in From the Ground Up, moving on to new responsibilities, but it's been an absolute blast speaking with all of you, working with my peers here, and maybe I'll be back in the future. Who knows? But anyways, thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or any comments, want to discuss anything we talk about on the podcast, feel free to reach out, uc3p@gmail.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.